Hi, friends. Instructor Catherine here, and today we are going to be talking about discussion guides. Many of us are doing work in qualitative research. I know many of our students are really looking to advance the quality of their qualitative research, and interview guides are such an important part of that. You know, how we collect the data is really an example of garbage in, garbage out, right? And we want to avoid that. We want to make sure we've got awesome discussion guides so we're collecting really great data. And so I've invited my friend Kate here today. Kate Sepp is a very experienced market researcher, primarily on the corporate side. She's been working in market research for over 15 years and primarily B2B, financial services, insurance, and related fields. And one of the things I always enjoy about working with Kate is that she is somebody who really shares our passion for making sure that research is done well. And so that's why I invited her to have this conversation. So thank you, Kate, for joining me here today.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm always thrilled to talk about research.
Excellent. So we've been talking about interview guides, and obviously different people have different points of view.
Mhm.
One of the things that I know a lot of folks struggle with is that when you're writing an interview guide, um, how do you strike that balance between having flexibility in the interview guide so there's room for discovery and discussion, but still have enough structure so you feel confident you're going to meet your research objectives?
That is a great place to start. So, as a corporate researcher, I find often that flexibility is really hard to come by. A discussion guide can become more than a discussion guide. It can become kind of an artifact as of the research. So part of my job really is to bring my stakeholders along. I understand their business, I understand their needs, and I connect them to the research being done so they end up applying the findings. So it quite often I will send out a discussion guide to a group of people who aren't terribly familiar with what we do. And as you can imagine, when you send out a guide, boy, do you get comments back. People love writing questions. So you normally can end up with an overpacked guide, not a lot of flexibility. And then it's really our role as, corporate researchers to get in there and understand the essence of what they're asking and ensure it becomes more of a conversation piece as it's intended to be, while at the same time addressing, the questions of your audience and stakeholders.
Excellent. And do you find that sometimes you have stakeholders who expect it to be more like a survey, like a questionnaire with closed-ended questions?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So it depends on their experience with research. So honestly, once, you bring people along on a few projects, they start to see how it goes, and then you get less and less questions as they're looking at guides in the future. It's important though, as a, corporate researcher, it's really our jobs to, own that piece and take control of it and know what good research looks like. So it's finding that balance of bringing people along, but at the same time, sticking to good research principles and, looking to get really good stuff out of what you're doing.
So there's a little bit of an education aspect, it sounds like.
Oh, there's always an education aspect. So you're always, every project, selling not only research and the specific project, taking people along on the process, how we do what we do to end up with good answers to ultimately what was their questions to begin with.
Got it. What about their expectations for the duration of the interviews? I know you and I talked previously about 60-minute IDIs, and you
Mm.
shared with me that you really aren't doing 60-minute IDIs.
No, no, we are moving away from that, and it's making our recruits so much more efficient. Like, we're trying to get to 45, even 30-minute IDIs. It's it takes so much focus though from yourself and from, your stakeholders too. It's what you're really trying to get out of the conversation. It has to show up in the learning objectives, and it has to translate down to the questions. So we really, as mentioned before, you just can't start throwing a lot of stuff in when you don't have a lot of time there. However, as I mentioned, you're going to have a lot more people answering your recruit a lot quicker. So you're going to be able to fulfill that. And it's getting harder and harder to recruit. So I feel that that's a lever we can pull to make it just a little bit easier on everybody.
Yeah, this reminds me of a conversation I had recently with somebody, and I had two people from the same client on the call. And one person was like really pushing for longer IDIs.
Mhm.
And then the other person was like, if somebody called me and asked me to do a 60-minute IDI, I wouldn't do it. So I don't believe that the people you're going to get who did
Mm-hmm.
say they would do a 60-minute IDI, I'm skeptical about whether they really represent the market of interest.
Oh, I agree. And even more so in the B2B space. So when you're talking to whether, financial advisors or doctors or whoever that is, the less and less time you're going to have. So you just got to keep, really sharp and really focused on what you're trying to do in every project that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you. So how do you then decide how many questions go into the IDI guide? If you are trying to stick to 30 or 45 minutes, do you have any rules of thumb that you use?
Well, if it's, it usually, if it's a group, say, you always got to put 10 minutes in the beginning to warm everybody up and a little bit of context. As I was trained, it's called the emotional handshake, letting everybody know that you are running the show and why they're here and what you'll be talking about. And then a 10-minute wrap up for final thoughts. So in the remaining time, maybe 10 to 15 questions. In a perfect world, I love to leave a lot of space. I'm really interested in what people need to are wanting to say. So you really want to leave that space to probe. I think, we're researchers. We are really interested in what people want to say. So, 10 to 15 questions. So it's not just the rapid fire question after question.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Fewer questions. I always find that that's a bit of a battle pushing people to,
Mhm.
but always really worthwhile then when you get that rich discovery back. But
Mhm.
sometimes you have to show it to them, like it really does work to have fewer
Right.
questions, and then you get those ahas, those unexpected things.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, you do a lot of work specifically in B2B, and I know many of our students either are, we do have a lot of students who are in B2B or do a mix of consumer and B2B. Do you have any experiences you can share or best practices specifically for B2B situations?
Um, well, going in, there's a really good chance you're discussing a really complicated concept with someone who knows more about the topic than you do. So it's just you're going in and the dynamic might be a little bit different. You're talking in my case, I'd be talking about a complicated like life insurance product with somebody who knows it inside and out, and there's always questions. In like this, I think it's really important, the beginning of that conversation, introducing yourself, going over your role in facilitating the conversation, and just talking about them, what the research is, what the research objectives are, and what we're going to be getting at through the conversation. So, keep them very structured, what we're here, why we're here, what we're doing, what is the outcome going to be. Just it's really helpful to have them understand what my role is and how we're going to go together through the next 30 minutes. And that really does show up in the guide. You got to kind of script that in a little bit to be more comfortable with it.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. It kind of reminds me from my days when I used to do a lot of research with IT managers, and I'm
Mhm.
not an IT manager.
Yes.
I knew a lot about IT.
Hmm.
Um, but what I would say back then was like, I know enough to know if the answers I'm getting make sense
Right.
or if I can probe. And I actually often found that being a little ignorant or naive actually was sometimes played into my favor. Can you help me understand more? And people wanted to help me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Love it when you ask for help understanding a concept, and that's where you get like really rich insights. It's interesting being in a place for a long time, especially at a corporation, because you do start to know the products and you do, I mean, if you're doing, again, I'll use life insurance. If you've done groups on life insurance for 7 years, you start to think you can talk a little bit about life insurance, but it's really kind of pushing that down or remembering your role in facilitating the conversation and pulling the goods out of other people.
Awesome. I love it. That is great. All right. So I'm going to conclude our conversation here with a sentence completion because we're researchers and we love sentence completions. So I'm going to read a sentence and you can just fill it in however you like.
Mhm.
Discussion guides intended to explore deep customer attitudes, needs, or aspirations are often derailed because.
Oh, oh, we're trying to do too much all the time. We're trying to inform too many objectives. Maybe we're trying to hit multiple initiatives with one set of groups because our budget's all crunched. In that case, you know, our guides lose focus and our conversations don't flow. So if like when you have to say, now we're going to shift topics more than, you know, 2 or 3 times, you can kind of think that there's something going on here and you might be packing it in a little bit too much in the guides. It's really important, I think, at least for the research from my team and I, that, you know, you're not just checking the research box, that you're giving things kind of enough room to grow on their own and staying focused to go in with some really clear objectives to get some really great insights out.
I love it. And then do you ever, thinking about this and making sure that the questions are going to get the meaningful results and it's not going to be too jam packed. Do you have any, do you keep like a library of favorite questions or favorite guides that you've used in the past that you know, that you've learned like, oh, these questions work well, or this sequence works well?
Mhm. I have a few favorite questions that I find myself going back to again and again. I love, you know, I always end with I try to work the magic wand question into everything. So if you could wave a magic wand and X, what would you do? But more often than not, I am always open-minded that I'm going to be reworking this guide as everything goes forward. So I will write it. I'll have a few favorites in there, but I will be open-minded between the first and second interviews to tweak and smooth down and tear it apart. And I know it's kind of a work in progress.
I'm really glad you talked about that because that is
Mhm.
something we talk about in our classes too. Like, this is one of the beauties of qualitative research versus quantitative. Yeah, we do pre-testing and survey research, but once the pre-test is done and the questionnaire is locked, it's locked. And we usually
Mhm.
don't want to make any changes because research tells us that even a small wording change can have an impact on response. With qualitative research, though, we don't have that restriction. It can be iterative. I can do a couple of IDIs or a couple of online community interactions,
Mhm.
change it, refine it, and go again. And maybe a few days later, do some more changes. And that's the beauty. We get to learn and iterate and
Mhm.
get better as we go.
Absolutely. And, you know, through every interview, we're all just trying to get better as we go.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because every company in the world these days talks about being data driven and customer centric, right? But I really think that right now, we've got all of this data that people are being bombarded with, but the real discovery in a lot of cases does come from qual. And so I think that, the focus on best practices, letting us make sure that we're not overly, manipulating or limiting a conversation because we've jammed too many questions and topics into a discussion guide is so important because, yeah, there's a lot of quantitative data out there, but for discovery, I really feel like qual is, there is a bit of a spotlight on qual. Like we really need qual now for innovation.
Oh, absolutely. Data can tell you what is happening. Qual can tell you why. And it's the why of why it's happening that makes it repeatable. So I agree 100%.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your candor today, Kate. I know our students will appreciate hearing from a research expert who's been in the field doing it for as long as you have, and especially in tough markets. B2B is always, a very particularly challenging area to do research in.